So the leaders of South Korea and Vietnam met in Hanoi and agreed to cooperate on energy and supply chains. For more, we're joined today by Dr. Joeffrey Calimag, Assistant Professor of Global Business Administration at Kyungsung University. Professor Calimag, thanks for coming on today.
Hello, good morning.
So President Lee Jae-myung became the first state guest under Vietnam's new leadership. What does this timing signal, and what do you make of yesterday's summit between President Lee and Vietnam's top leader?
Oh, yeah, the fact that President Lee is the first head of state guest under Vietnam's new leadership, President and General Secretary To Lam, this rather shows more than just a ceremonial act. I see this as a symbolic positioning because it signals that Seoul is being prioritized as a foundational partner in Hanoi's new era and future. And with regards to the summit yesterday, my take on that is it wasn't just about optics. It was about setting the tone for a recalibrated regional order, especially that countries recently are akin to moving towards fragmentation, meaning kind of less integration sort of globalization. This scenario is analogous to Vietnam, saying that their next chapter begins with Korea at the table. Putting Korea at the forefront sends a strategic message to both Beijing and Washington. And because normally it's rare for a middle power like Korea to be the opening act, I would say in another country's leadership transition, thereby this only shows Seoul's rising diplomatic weight and role.
I see. And this trip included both Vietnam and India, as the administration has been emphasizing what it calls global South diplomacy. So why are diplomatic ties with these two countries, Vietnam and India, so important for South Korea right now?
Well, President Lee's visits are about pragmatic and targeted diplomacy. Each country was chosen for a specific strategic reason, and I would say that Vietnam and India are not random choices, but instead they are anchor states in the global south. Together, they represent nearly 1.6 billion people and economies growing at 6 to 7% annually. For Korea, this is about hedging against geopolitical risk. India is the world's fastest growing major economy, targeted or projected to surpass Germany and Japan in GDP by the early 2030s. Vietnam is the fastest growing economy in ASEAN, and so by deepening ties with Vietnam and India, Korea is essentially building a South-South corridor that that diversifies beyond the U.S.-China binary. As I mentioned earlier, countries are gearing towards fragmented world, and as a result, it is creating new and more sustainable alliances, taking into consideration the risk that the two powerful countries have impacted the world, especially the economy. Apparently, South Korea, with its new role and influence vis-a-vis significance, it's a bold attempt to reposition Korea as a bridge nation between advanced economies and emerging powers.
Right, you just mentioned Vietnam has a very fast-growing economy, and Vietnam was actually South Korea's third largest trading partner last year after China and the United States. So what's driving this strong trade partnership? And as global supply chains shift, how important is Vietnam to South Korea's efforts to reduce reliance on China?
Yes, you're right. Vietnam is actually the centerpiece of Korea's ASEAN ties. And as you mentioned, it is its largest trade partner. Last year, bilateral trade hit nearly $80 billion, making Vietnam more important to Korea than Japan in trade terms. So what's driving this? I can mention two things. First is supply chain realignment. Korean firms are shifting production from China to Vietnam. In fact, over 40% of Samsung's smartphones are now assembled in Vietnam. And second is demographics. Vietnam's median age is just 32, giving Korea access to young, tech-savvy workforce. Also, take into account the migration diaspora between South Korea and Vietnam. Vietnam has the biggest Korean community in ASEAN, and on the other hand, Vietnam is the second largest group of diaspora in Korea. As global supply chains fragment, Vietnam is Korea's China plus one strategy in action. It's not just about reducing reliance on China, it's about creating a parallel hub that can absorb shocks from the U.S.-China tensions. In strategic terms, Vietnam is becoming Korea's second factory floor.
Right, I see. And a large business delegation is also accompanying President Lee Jae-myung on this trip, including the heads of South Korea's major firms like Samsung, LG, Hyundai, and SK. So what makes Vietnam such an attractive market for Korean firms, and what are these companies hoping to achieve from this visit?
Yeah, President Lee went to Vietnam and into with the conglomerates. So the presence of Samsung, LG, Hyundai, and SK is very telling. They're not just chasing cheap labor; they are chasing market depth. And Vietnam's middle class is expected to double by 2030, reaching nearly 50 million consumers. For Samsung, it's about consolidating Vietnam as its global production base. For Hyundai, it's about tapping into Southeast Asia's booming demand for electric vehicles. For SK and LG, it's about energy and digital infrastructure. But all of these mentioned conglomerates, what they hope to achieve is, again, twofold. Number one is lock in Vietnam as a strategic hub for manufacturing and research and development. And second, it shapes the rules of the game in Vietnam's next phase of industrial policy. In short, Korean companies see Vietnam not just as a market, but I would say, a launchpad for the wider ASEAN region.
I see. All right, Professor Calimag, thank you so much for your time and insight today. We appreciate it.
Thank you, and have a nice day.
Thank you.